Welcome back to Pause Mongolia podcast. A few months ago, I attended an exhibition at the Embassy of Mongolia in Washington, D.C., supporting wild camel conservation. While I was there, I found myself thinking about camels in a way I hadn't for a long time. Growing up in Mongolia, camels were always present in books and stories. I remember picture books when I was very young, and elementary school and middle school we learned about wildlife and rare species through school programs. So when I attended the exhibition, I wasn't learning about camels for the first time. The animal had already been part of my imagination for many years. Then I started thinking about my friend from college years. We lived in the same dormitory. Her name is Otko, and she comes from southern part of Mongolia, province called Umungov. Sometimes she would bring products from home, including camel milk. Years later, last year 2025, we exchanged messages again. During our conversation, she told me that her mother is now 100 years old and still living in Omungov. That conversation stayed with me, and somehow it brought me back to thinking about the wild camel. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. How long have wild camels lived in this region? Where they did come from originally? How different are they from the domestic camels that many people know? And if they are so well adapted to survival, why are conservation organizations working so hard to protect them today? The wild camel is not simply a domestic camel living in the wild. For many years, many people assumed they were essentially the same animal. But genetic research tells a different story. The wild camel is considered a separate species. When conservationists talk about protecting the wild camel, they are trying to protect unique species, a species with its own evolutionary history, a species that cannot be replaced once it's gone. Another interesting part of the story is where camels came from. Today, most people associated camels with Asia, the Middle East, or Africa, but scientists believe ancient camel ancestors first evolved in North America. Over a very long period of time, different camel relatives spread into other parts of the world. Some eventually became the ancestors of llamas and alpaca in South America. Others moved into Asia and became the ancestors of the camels we know today. The camels eventually disappeared from North America, but they survived elsewhere, and one branch eventually became the wild camel. I think that's one reason their species is so interesting. When we look at the wild camel in Mongolia today, we are looking at the very old lineage that has survived enormous environmental changes. The wild camel is also an extraordinary survivor. Life in the Gobi is not easy. Water can be scarce, food can be scarce, temperatures can change dramatically depending on the season. Yet wild camels continue to survive there. Scientists have documented adaptation that help them live in these conditions. Their humps store fat that can be used as energy. They can travel long distances in search of resources. They can tolerate conditions that would be difficult for many other large mammals. The more I read about them, the more I realize that resilience is one of the defining themes of this animal's story. And perhaps that's why camels appeared so often in the books and stories I read growing up. People admire animals that endure. People also admire animals that adapt and survive. But survival does not mean safety. Today, the wild camel remains one of the rarest large mammals. That's why conservation organizations continue to work on behalf of the species. One of the most important organizations involved in this effort is the Wild Camel Protection Foundation. The organization was established specifically to protect wild camels and their habitat. Its work included research education, breeding programs, and support for conservation efforts in Mongolia and China. The foundation has worked with scientists, protected area staff, and conservation partners for many years. The goal is straightforward: to ensure that wild camels remain part of the landscape and do not disappear. Conservation involves many different people: scientists, researchers, park staff, educators, donors, artists, photographers, and ordinary people who care about wildlife. Everyone contributes in a different way. Some people collect scientific data. Some people help raise funding. Some people create awareness through art and photography. Others work directly in the field. The wild camel has survived remarkable challenges. The question now is whether future generations will continue to see this species in the wild. That question is still being answered, and that's why the work continues today. As I finished reading about the wild camel, one thought stayed with me. We often think conservation success is measured by the number of animals or the size of protected area. These are important indicators, but they are only part of the picture. For species like the wild camel, I think the more interesting question is whether we are continuing to learn from it. Every decade brings new research methods. Genomics becomes more precise. Satellite technology improves. Artificial intelligence is beginning to change how wildlife is monitored. Ecological modeling continues to improve. Questions that could not be answered 20 years ago maybe become routine research in the future. That means the scientific value of the wild camel is not fixed. It continues to grow as our ability to study it improves. I also think the future of this species will depend less on one major breakthrough and more on long-term continuity. Long-term field study that continues for future may tell us more than dozens of short projects. A new generation of Mongolian wildlife biologists may contribute ideas that simply did not exist before. International researchers may bring different expertise, while local scientists contribute decades of knowledge about the Gobi Desert itself. Neither replaces the other. Together, they produce much more complete picture. Looking ahead, I hope the wild camel becomes known not only as one of the rarest mammals on Earth, but also as of the best studied desert species. That would be meaningful achievement, not because recognition is the goal, but because deeper scientific understanding almost always leads to better decisions. For Mongolia, I think there is a unique opportunity. Few countries have the privilege of protecting species found almost nowhere else. That creates not only responsibility, but also the opportunity to become a global center for research on desert ecology, evolutionary biology, and wildlife adaptation. The wild camel could become one of the species that brings scientists from different disciplines and different countries all together. When I think about the future, I don't imagine finish line where the work is complete. I imagine future in which every generation understands a little more than previous one. Better questions, better collaboration, and better data, and better decisions. The future of the wild camel will not be defined by a single discovery or single organization. It will be shaped by decades of careful observation, scientific curiosity, and people who are willing to continue asking questions that have not yet been answered. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the remarkable animal. Not only that survived the Gobi Desert, but that is continues to expand our understanding in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Thank you so much for listening. Pause Mongolia podcast. Follow this podcast, write a review, and share it with your friends and family. Together, we can grow this podcast and bring more awareness and compassion into the world.